July 27th, 2021. Early morning. A commercial warehouse somewhere in New Jersey. Homeland Security Investigations special agents pull into position alongside officers from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the General Services Administration Office of Inspector General, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. 5 federal agencies converging on a single address to pull open a warehouse door and look inside at what had been quietly poisoning the United States military supply chain for 7 years. What they found filled rows of shelving units, routers, switches, networking modules, SFP transceivers, all of them bearing the iconic Cisco Systems logo. All of them wrapped in Cisco-branded packaging, many of them shrink-wrapped to look exactly as they would on the shelf of a legitimate technology reseller. Agents began counting. 100, 200. By the time the inventory was complete, they had documented approximately 1,156 counterfeit and fraudulent Cisco devices in a single location. Devices that had been imported from China and Hong Kong. Devices with forged labels and fake serial numbers. Devices that, had any of them made their way into a military router rack or a government data center without being caught here, might have been processing classified communications, routing sensitive logistics data, or sitting at the edge of a network that no foreign adversary should ever touch. This is the story of how one man built a counterfeit technology empire out of cheap foreign hardware and expensive forged logos. How he threaded fake Cisco gear into the procurement systems that supply the United States government, and how 5 federal agencies spent years building the case that finally shut him down. To understand the scheme, you have to understand what makes the networking equipment market so vulnerable to exactly this kind of fraud. Cisco Systems is the dominant manufacturer of enterprise-grade routers and switches, the hardware backbone of corporate networks, hospital systems, university campuses, and critically, military bases and federal agencies. A genuine Cisco Catalyst switch or ASR router might retail for several $1,000s. A top-of-the-line module might retail for tens of thousands. The price gap between what these devices cost to manufacture and what they sell for on the enterprise market is enormous. And that gap creates an opportunity for anyone willing to falsify a label. The counterfeit Cisco trade out of China and Hong Kong is a documented and well-known problem in the technology industry. Manufacturers there can produce a device that looks like a Cisco product. Same chassis dimensions, same ports, same plastic housing, by purchasing older or lower grade components and installing pirated firmware. Slap a forged Cisco holographic label on the back, print a fake serial number, box it in counterfeit Cisco packaging, and you have something that might pass initial visual inspection. The trouble comes when the device fails or when it performs in unexpected ways. Counterfeit networking gear has been known to crash under load, to run outdated or tampered firmware, to lack the security features the real hardware would provide, and in some documented cases to introduce vulnerabilities that a sophisticated adversary could exploit. The federal indictment in this case centered on a defendant whose name, according to court documents and the Justice Department's own public statements, was Onur Aksoy. Aksoy was the operator of what prosecutors described as a sprawling network of shell companies and front businesses referred to collectively in federal records as the pro-network entities. The exact number of these entities ran into the dozens. Some were registered under different names with different nominal addresses. Some operated different websites. Some had different phone numbers and different contact personas. Together they functioned as a single distribution machine, buying counterfeit and fraudulent Cisco products in bulk from suppliers in China and Hong Kong and selling them to buyers in the United States, buyers who believed, or at least had reason to believe, that they were purchasing genuine Cisco equipment. The operation ran, according to federal prosecutors, from approximately 2014 through 2021. 7 years of importing fake gear, listing it for sale, collecting payment, and shipping counterfeit hardware to customers. And critically, those customers were not just small businesses looking for a bargain on used networking equipment. The government's case documents make clear that counterfeit devices sold through pro-network entities made their way into federal procurement channels. They made their way to the United States military. They were processed through purchasing systems that are supposed to vet vendors and verify product authenticity. The fact that they got through for years is part of what makes this case significant beyond the financial fraud itself. Prosecutors alleged in the indictment that the retail value of the counterfeit Cisco devices Aksoy trafficked over the course of the scheme was enormous. According to the Justice Department's public case statements, the total fake retail value of goods involved in the conspiracy reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars, with some federal filings reporting figures that exceeded $1 billion in fraudulent claimed retail value when calculated across the full scope of the operation and devices identified across multiple investigations. The July 2021 warehouse raid alone, netting those approximately 1,156 devices, represented a stated retail value exceeding $7 million. That is one warehouse, one day, one coordinated federal sweep, and $7 million in fraudulent goods on the shelves. The mechanics of the scheme were straightforward but required careful execution to avoid detection. Aksoy's network would receive shipments from China and Hong Kong. The shipping documentation would typically misrepresent the contents, a common tactic in counterfeit goods smuggling to reduce the chance that a CBP examiner would pull the container for a closer look. Packages might be labeled as generic electronic components, or the shipment manifests might understate the declared value. When the shipments arrived at US ports, some were cleared through without inspection, others were flagged, and this is where CBP's involvement in the eventual investigation became crucial. Agents with expertise in identifying counterfeit technology goods began encountering suspicious Cisco-branded items in containers linked to Aksoy's network. Those examinations fed into the broader multi-agency investigation that would ultimately produce the 2021 warehouse raid and the charges that followed. On the sales side, pro-network entities operated primarily through online marketplaces and business-to-business reseller channels. Customers looking for networking hardware at prices below Cisco's list prices, a common goal for IT procurement departments working within budget, would find listings from entities controlled by Aksoy. The listings would represent the products as genuine. Sometimes the products were described as new, sometimes as refurbished, sometimes with language that skirted the edges of explicit warranty claims. Customers would place orders, orders would ship, and in many cases those customers would receive hardware that initially seemed functional but either failed prematurely, behaved unexpectedly, or was later identified as counterfeit during a Cisco authenticity verification check. Cisco Systems itself has an internal team dedicated to identifying and reporting counterfeit products. When customers or law enforcement submit suspect devices for examination, Cisco's engineers run forensic checks, examining internal component markings, firmware signatures, and hardware serial numbers against their own manufacturing records. In the Aksoy case, Cisco's authenticity assessments of seized devices consistently confirmed what investigators already suspected: the hardware was not genuine. Some devices used older or lower-grade components not present in the legitimate products they purported to be. Some had firmware that was either a pirated copy of the real Cisco operating system or a non-functional imitation. Some had forged holographic security labels that, under close inspection, differed in printing quality and substrate from Cisco's actual security markings. The national security dimension of this case is what elevated it from a standard counterfeit goods prosecution to something that drew the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and NCIS into the investigation alongside HSI. DCIS, the law enforcement arm of the Department of Defense Inspector General, investigates fraud against the DoD. NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, investigates crimes affecting the Navy and Marine Corps. Their involvement tells you something specific about the nature of this case. Fake Cisco equipment was not just showing up in corporate server rooms, it was showing up in procurement chains that supply military installations, naval facilities, and defense contractors. Networking equipment in those environments routes sensitive data. It connects secure enclaves to external systems. It sits at the edge of networks that are supposed to be hardened against foreign intrusion. The nightmare scenario that keeps cybersecurity professionals awake is not just that a counterfeit switch might fail unexpectedly and crash a network at a critical moment. It is the more sophisticated possibility that hardware sourced from adversary nations might contain undisclosed functionality, backdoors, firmware modifications, monitoring capabilities that legitimate equipment does not. While there is no finding in the Aksoy case that his specific devices were modified for intelligence collection purposes, the structural vulnerability his operation created was real. When procurement processes are defeated by fraudulent documentation and fake labels, when the gear in a military network rack has an unknown and unverified provenance, the chain of custody that security policy depends on is broken. The investigation that built toward the July 2021 warehouse raid was years in the making. HSI, which has broad jurisdiction over financial crimes, customs fraud, and intellectual property theft with international dimensions, took the lead coordinating role. Special agents working the case developed an understanding of the pro-network entity structure, the web of company names, websites, bank accounts, and shipping addresses that Aksoy used to receive foreign shipments and distribute products domestically. The investigation mapped the financial flows, where money went when a customer paid for a router, how funds moved between the shell entities, and eventually how funds connected back to Aksoy as the central figure controlling the operation. CBP's role included intelligence work at the ports of entry. Agents with specialized knowledge of counterfeit technology goods can identify suspect shipments during examination, looking at declared values against the quantity and apparent quality of goods, checking whether labels and documentation are consistent with genuine Cisco shipment patterns, and running serial numbers against known authentic ranges. When CBP agents flagged shipments associated with pro-network entities, that intelligence went into the investigative file. Some shipments were seized outright at the border. Others were allowed to proceed in a controlled fashion to build the evidentiary chain back to the warehousing and distribution operation. GSA-OIG, the General Services Administration's Office of Inspector General, brought expertise in government procurement fraud. The GSA operates the Federal Supply Schedule, one of the main contracting vehicles through which federal agencies and the military purchase commercial technology products. Investigators with GSA-OIG were able to document the ways in which counterfeit Cisco products entered government purchasing channels, tracing purchase orders, delivery records, and payment documentation through the federal procurement system to identify instances where agencies had unknowingly paid for genuine equipment and received counterfeit hardware instead. The financial fraud charges in this case rested on multiple legal theories. The core count was conspiracy to traffic in counterfeit goods, a federal felony under Title 18. When a defendant knowingly sells goods bearing a counterfeit mark of a trademark owner like Cisco, without the trademark owner's consent and with intent to deceive, that constitutes trafficking in counterfeit goods under federal law. The sentencing guidelines for this offense take into account the value of the counterfeit goods, and given the scale of Aksoy's operation, the guidelines' exposure was substantial. Beyond the trademark counterfeiting charge, prosecutors alleged mail fraud and wire fraud. Every time Aksoy's entities sent a counterfeit product through the mail and collected payment via electronic means, credit card, bank wire, or online payment system, they were potentially committing wire fraud by making fraudulent representations in interstate commerce and obtaining money by those means. The mail fraud count encompasses the same conduct when the shipments traveled through the U.S. Postal Service or commercial carriers, and when the proceeds of those fraudulent sales were then moved between bank accounts, used to pay for additional counterfeit inventory, or otherwise cycled through the financial system, they became the subject of money laundering charges. In June 2023, Onur Aksoy pleaded guilty. He stood in federal court in the District of New Jersey and admitted the core of what the government had spent years documenting. He admitted to conspiring to traffic in counterfeit goods. He admitted to the mail fraud and wire fraud and money laundering that the scheme depended on. The guilty plea resolved the criminal charges without a trial, foreclosing any possibility that a jury might hear evidence the government preferred to keep out of open court, including potentially classified details about which specific military systems or government networks had received fraudulent devices. The sentencing came in October 2023. U.S. District Judge Robert Kirsch, sitting in Newark, New Jersey, sentenced Aksoy to 6 years and 6 months in federal prison, 78 months. That sentence reflected the severity of the conduct, not just a garden variety counterfeiting scheme, but one that specifically targeted and penetrated government and military procurement channels over a period of years. Aksoy was also ordered to pay restitution. The investigation and prosecution of this case involves sustained coordination across agencies that do not always work together smoothly. CBP had physical seizure data from ports of entry. HSI had financial records and corporate structure documentation built across years of surveillance. DCIS and NCIS had procurement records showing where specific devices had ended up inside the defense supply chain. GSA-OIG had contract data tracing the purchases. Cisco Systems provided authentication analysis, pulling all of that together into a coherent criminal case, one that could be presented to a grand jury for indictment and ultimately resolved with a guilty plea, required the kind of interagency discipline that this prosecution demonstrated throughout. There's a broader context to the Aksoy case that federal authorities have been careful to document publicly. Counterfeit Cisco equipment is not a new problem, and it is not a small one. Over the years, HSI and CBP have documented dozens of enforcement actions involving fake Cisco hardware imported from China and Hong Kong. The scale of the counterfeit Cisco market globally is difficult to quantify precisely, but Cisco itself has stated publicly that it devotes significant resources to brand protection and anti-counterfeiting enforcement, and that fake Cisco products represent a meaningful fraction of the grey market networking equipment traded worldwide. What makes the Aksoy case distinctive is the breadth of the pro-network entities network, dozens of shell companies functioning as a single integrated distribution operation, and the documented penetration of defense procurement. Federal law enforcement has been particularly attentive to counterfeit hardware cases that have a national security dimension precisely because the risk is qualitatively different from, say, fake luxury handbags. A fake handbag fails the consumer in economic terms. A fake router installed in a military base or a naval communications center creates a vulnerability of a different order, one that adversaries with sophisticated capabilities might be well positioned to exploit if the hardware has been modified or if its unknown provenance means security verification protocols never ran as intended. In the years since the July 2021 warehouse raid and the eventual 2023 conviction, the case has been cited by federal agencies as an example of the counterfeit hardware threat and the importance of supply chain vetting. The Department of Defense tightened its guidance on hardware verification in the period following high-profile cases like this one. GSA procurement rules were reinforced with additional vendor due diligence requirements, and the cross-agency task force model used in the Aksoy investigation, HSI leading, with DCIS, NCIS, GSA-OIG, and CBP each contributing specialized expertise, has been cited as a template for future counterfeit technology prosecutions. The 1,156 counterfeit Cisco devices that federal agents documented in that New Jersey warehouse in July 2021 represent the physical evidence the investigation was able to seize on a single day. They are the visible fraction of what the government alleged was a 7-year supply of fraudulent hardware, much of it already dispersed into corporate and government networks before investigators arrived. Some of that dispersed hardware was identified and removed when purchasers were notified. Some of it may still be operating in networks where its origin was never flagged, where a procurement officer received it, installed it, and never ran an authenticity check. That is the residue of a scheme like this one. It does not end cleanly with an arrest and a guilty plea. It ends in an inventory audit that never quite closes, in IT teams checking serial numbers against Cisco's online verification tools years after the fact, in a quiet question about which switches and which routers and which racks were real and which were not. The Justice Department announced Aksoy's sentence with language about protecting military networks and defense procurement, and those are not abstract concerns. The supply chain for the equipment that runs American military communications runs through vendors and procurement processes and counterfeit networks that, as this case demonstrates, someone with enough shell companies and enough suppliers in China can penetrate for 7 years before investigators catch up. 6.5 years in federal prison, 78 months for the man who stood at the center of a network of dozens of fake companies, who was caught with approximately 1,156 counterfeit Cisco devices in a single warehouse seizure, who moved what prosecutors described as hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent claimed retail value through military and government supply chains over the course of his operation. The sentence is federal, meaning no parole. Aksoy will serve the full time minus whatever good conduct credit the Bureau of Prisons applies. The 5 agencies that walked into that New Jersey warehouse on a July morning in 2021, HSI, DCIS, NCIS, GSA-OIG, and CBP, walked out with evidence that had been sitting in plain sight behind a warehouse door. The case it built was methodical, multi-agency, and years in the making. The sentence it produced was significant. What it could not fully undo was the network of fake equipment that had already moved through the supply chain, had already been installed in federal facilities, had already passed through hands that trusted it was real because the logo on the box said it was. That is the particular difficulty of counterfeit hardware as a crime. The fraud travels in the product, and the product travels everywhere.